This is not like one of the presentations that I've done kind of in the past over the specific leadership books. Since going through this class that I'm in right now for school, which is strategy and leadership theory, we've gone through a very interesting, comprehensive history of the different theories of leadership through the ages and how that kind of affects, you know, modern strategy, modern warfare strategy, that kind of thing. So I was going to just go through a couple of the points that I learned in those units of that class because it's fascinating and I think it really pertains to what we talk about all the time here in this context. So hopefully y'all will be able to kind of see where we get some of the ideas that we talk about and get some context and history out of it. So first of all, most of the points that I'll be addressing fall into one of these two categories: transactional leadership and transformational leadership. Transactional leadership it occurs when one person takes the initiative in making contact with others for the purpose of an exchange. It implies reward as a contingent and management by exception, either in an active or passive way. This is the one that leads to fallacious methods and tactics of leadership, and we'll get into those pitfalls later. And then there's transformational leadership, which is more the positive theory, and occurs when one or more persons engage with others in such a way that leaders and followers raise one another to higher levels of motivation and morality. They motivate each other to achieve higher levels of success and push each other towards that higher standard. So here we get into different, like, the theories of how leadership arises in people and how it's deployed as a strategy for driving the organization. And, you know, they're not all good. I'll just get into that right now. They're not all good ideas. And there are a lot of that have been debunked or replaced with better theories, but I think it's just super interesting to go through them and see how we still use remnants of those ideas today. Like, first of all, we have Carlyle in 1902, who purported the born not made theory of leadership. And this one is that traits which are necessary for leadership are inherited. They comprise of things like intelligence and self-confidence, determination, integrity, and sociability. And this was in the early part of this theory, which, you know, you could probably already tell by me just listing those characteristics that it's garbage, because intelligence and self-confidence are not born or inherited traits. You learn how to be self-confident, and you can learn how to be sociable and determined. Now, however, when we talk about this kind of leadership theory, it's more traits like extroversion versus introversion and conscientiousness, openness to new experiences, how agreeable you can be, and how emotionally stable you are versus how neurotic you are. However, it's still problematic in that it leads to what we call the ableist man theory, which is that the ablest man of any place should be raised and elevated to the supreme place or revered as the perfect government. Now, this seems riddled with fallacious thinking, which any examination of like any kind of underdog story will automatically just decimate this argument, I think. But I mean, we do still look at these qualities, especially the ones in the second point, when determining like how qualified somebody is for leadership. On the other hand, we have behavior and style approach, which is developed earlier in the 20th century. And this is more focused on what people learn as opposed to what traits they were born with. It is comprised of two different approaches, task-oriented and interpersonally oriented. The task-oriented one is generally associated with accomplishing assigned tasks by organizing task-related activities, and interpersonally oriented is commonly linked to how well the leader or potential leader can maintain interpersonal relationships by tending to others' morale and welfare. And this, I think, is connected to servant leadership, which we'll get into in the next slide. Now, the real doozy here that I thought was just wild was determinism. And those of you who have any kind of like, biblical knowledge, what do y'all like? Have y'all heard of determinism in the theological sense? Anyone? No? Okay, well, I can briefly explain it. It's like determinism in theology is essentially the theory that none of us have any kind of free will or personal choice. We are just kind of slaves to the way things are going to go. Like if you were meant to do something, it's going to happen regardless of any kind of decision you might want to make, either for or against that thing happening. This is kind of the same concept. It's purported mainly by Tolstoy in the early 1900s. It purports that man is inconsequential. Any one individual is inconsequential because leaders function upon mutually confirmed expectations. So it doesn't even matter if a great leader falls or fails because another is going to take his place. The man has little to do with the events his leadership is linked to. He is an unconscious instrument that exists amid the predestination and inevitability of history. So it makes even the greatest leader just a slave for history's purpose. He has really no agency, which is garbage. And then this kind of leads into contingency leadership and theory, which is that the situation or event for which leadership is needed, it calls for the leader to adapt to the situation's elements, such as the nature of the task, the emotional, motivational, and skill levels of the followers, the quality of the leader-follower relationship. It's like the leadership and the leadership style, tactic, strategy is dependent upon or contingent upon the situation in which leadership is required. So then we see later on in, well, I guess also in the early 2000s, we get kind of in-group and out-group theory, which is a little bit different and speaks to, I think, a fallacious and ineffective, more so, way of conducting leadership, because it's all about role differentiation and that transactional leadership tactic. It begins with the observation that role differentiation and social interaction prompts leaders to have different relationships among different subordinates. Like if you're in the in-group, you earn more time and support from leaders, and in exchange tend to accomplish more and champion innovation. Whereas if you're in the out-group, members are treated fairly but accomplish their contractual job and little more. It's about initial establishment in one of these roles, which is determined by the dynamics that occurred during an early phase or early stage in a relationship between the subordinate and the leader. And so then, this is addressed or can be addressed by the idea of servant leadership, which actually first came up in the 1970s by this Greenleaf, who was a professor in the era of the civil rights movement. And after that, was seeing the effects of diminished leadership roles in universities and just kind of reformed the way people thought about how to run those institutions. And he said that people who occupy leadership roles should view themselves as servants to those they lead, and followers should only just respond to their leadership. It emphasizes attentiveness to followers' concerns, emphasizes empathy and nurturing qualities in leaders. And going through the leadership book, I think I've seen quite a few examples of this. So then, going from all of those different theories of how to conduct leadership, we get into pitfalls. Like culture and leadership omnipotence. This definitely comes from that determinism idea, in that leadership is an omnipotent force embedded in the culture of an organization. So if a culture is the set of key values, assumptions, and understandings shared by members of an organization, then that builds up what a leader should be in the mind of an organization. And that's going to be what leaders produced by this culture just are. Therefore, passive or even absent leadership is fine once a desired culture is established, because members of a culture will lead themselves and the next generation of leaders to be product of the established culture, and then to be purporters and supporters of that established culture. Again, this is fallacious thinking because it leads to charismatic leadership and laissez-faire leadership. So charismatic leadership are literally just charismatic leaders who are kind of heroes within an organization, and they're idolized. And this can lead to like gurus among an organization, which are, you know, leaders that like the well-being of the organization or even of followers depends not on a set of principles, but on the leader themselves. Like they're the types of leaders that don't really make clear what their doctrine is. So if you do something wrong, you can't go to a set of principles or a guideline for how things are done. You have to go back to the guru over and over, and that's how they just garner more and more respect. And you can also think of any cult leader. Like, this is how that gets going through this charismatic leadership idea. It's like it's that building up of a hero. On the other side of the extreme scale is the laissez-faire, which is literally just non-leadership. It's a hands-off approach, purported by that idea that leadership is going to happen based on your culture. It's an assumption that does not follow through, because oftentimes leaders who take on this principle fail to pick up relevant information, or may send cues to their subordinates that they're not interested in receiving new information or ideas to improve. So what's the answer to these? Accountability. So accountability is, it's essential for trust. When things go wrong, people need to see that a leader is going to take actions to fix what went wrong, correct problems, etc. They'll evaluate, accountability evaluates situations and leadership methods, and holds people responsible for their actions or inaction. It lends itself to a stronger trust relationship, and how it also lends itself to better management of how leaders execute their elements of power that they have, which I have here as kind of a closer, just to go over how leaders get things done in organizational, military, any kind of those aspects. So first, We have legitimate power, which is authority granted from a formal position or an organization. Pretty straightforward. Then there's reward power, which stems from the authority to bestow compensation to others for various things like work or innovation. Then there's expert power, which comes from a leader's special knowledge or skills viewed by subordinates. Both of these together make gurus. It's like if you have the expertise and don't pass that on to your subordinates, and you also have the power to give and take away important resources, then that can be a position from which problems can arise unless there's a serious accountability safety net. And then there's referent power, which also builds into this model, which generates admiration and prompts followers to emulate the leader. And lastly, and worse, is the coercive power to punish or recommend punishment. It's manifested by the privilege to discharge, demote, or criticize, and it's often called the negative side of legitimate or reward power. So you see we go kind of from up the top being the most responsible to the least responsible and the most harmful. So hopefully this presentation better helps you understand the history of leadership theory, where these ideas of leadership models and theory come from, and how we still employ these ideas today. This picture I have is Tolstoy, the determinism guy. Just Tolstoy. Yeah. So that concludes my presentation.